Alright everyone, there's a new strain of super malaria now to worry about. This is in addition to super AIDS, which doesn't respond as well to antiretroviral compounds. Super polio, which is, emerging in some areas, I believe. I think it was polio. And also tuberculosis has become drug resistant largely. Now there are hundreds of millions of people in this world with like TB, you know that. Now in some populations, people get enough nutrition. TB is generally not a problem. Like, if a person is properly nourished, they tend not to have any symptoms. They're not communicating it very readily. They're not coughing up a lung. Really, 100 years ago when people were malnourished on a general basis, that's when TB was a problem. Today, there are plenty of people who carry it, and they never have any symptoms. And then, of course, some people get a little bit sick and it goes away. It doesn't become chronic. That's because the world, generally speaking, has better access to food now than it did in the past. Of course, you go to some parts of the third world, that's not the case. But now they've got malaria that does not respond to artemisium, I believe it is. I believe that's the name of the compound, taken from absinthe wormwood, actually. Yeah, you should drink absinthe if you're in the third world, I guess. Maybe that'll help. They used to use quinine, and then they used chloroquine. And I think that chloroquine is beginning to lose its effectiveness at the same time to the same resistant strain, so you're basically screwed. Now, it emerged in Cambodia first. It's where they first documented it. It's spreading throughout Laos, Thailand, and now Vietnam as well. How many hundreds of millions of people live in this region of the world? Yeah, see, that's a problem, and there's also trade and travel to a high degree within this region. What happens when it hits China? It's going to be a bigger problem. What happens when it hits Indonesia? What happens when it hits India? Yeah, you're going to have several billion people with largely incurable forms of malaria, and a lot of them are going to die. It's going to become a huge pandemic in that region, I think, at this point. Because I can't imagine that they're going to develop something that's actually capable of treating it. What we should have done in the world, and the big worry is it spreads to Africa too, and then through the Middle East, and pretty soon the world's engulfed in super malaria. What we should have done as a world, and we could have done this half a century ago, when we first began developing the concept of antibiotics, mass deployment of vaccines, sanitation, pesticide spraying to wipe out certain hosts, reservoirs for disease, we should have upped the ante by several orders of magnitude, mass deployed it worldwide, just fucking wipe out all of the diseases that we can as quickly as possible so that they never had a chance to evolve. What was the problem? Of course, people back then didn't understand the concept that a disease could escape the normal treatment that would be deployed. They said, oh, these sulfa drugs are wonderful. We can cure stuff that used to kill like 9/10 of the people that got it. We can cure it in a day now. We can cure syphilis. We can cure everything. We can cure staph infections. Your wound is malignant? That's okay. We'll just pump it full of this chemical. Tomorrow you'll be up and walking. You'll feel just fine. 1 or 2 injections. That's all you need. Unfortunately, they didn't deploy it widely enough, and so these diseases never went away. They just, over time, had the capability to develop. The biggest concern, though, in my mind, is actually drug-resistant AIDS more than anything else. Because malaria doesn't kill everybody that gets malaria. It doesn't always become chronic, recurrent, and eventually knock them off. Teddy Roosevelt style. I think didn't he die of complications from a chronic malarial infection? I'm pretty sure he did. I'm pretty sure it finally took his life, and he was a strong, hardly malnourished dude. This kind of dude that walks 10 miles a day and calls it his day off. But super AIDS is worse because it's still 100% untreatable. You cannot cure AIDS. The big problem is this. We have people now that are attempting to normalize having AIDS to the point where they're like, oh, if you don't want to have sex with somebody who tells you they have HIV because they're undergoing treatment, so it's okay, well, then you're a bigot or something. Some people will be receptive to this argument, unfortunately, and it'll make it spread further. Because if it weren't resistant, you could make that argument and say, well, yeah, but we can treat it now, suppress the symptoms, no problem. You're not even passing it to anybody because you have no viral load. Yeah, unfortunately, there are now strains of it that don't respond so well to the antiretroviral treatments normally prescribed for it. Whoops. Yeah, we accidentally normalized spreading an incurable disease around that will become highly lethal again as soon as it gets done evolving a little bit more. And it will. We've seen it didn't take that long for all of these diseases to evolve now, did they? What happens is a virus, a bacterium, something, becomes quite prevalent. You deploy treatment. In a very small number of those cases, the treatment's not complete. The next generation of viruses that then spreads locally or regionally is more resistant than in the past. You mass deploy again. Again, you have one reservoir that doesn't quite get killed off. You only need one person with that virus in their body. Or with that, in the case of malaria, I believe a plasmid, if I remember correctly. Or parasite. What's it classed as? It's not classed as, I know it's not a virus. It's like some little weird thing that gets into your blood cells. And people who are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia are actually already resistant to malaria. So kudos to them. I guess you survive. You get less symptoms. It doesn't become chronic very often. And you're kind of protected. Of course, then you get sickle cell itself, and it's not a pretty sight. But this is going to become a huge problem. It's not going away. It's been 2 decades since they started warning, oh yeah, we've got superbugs looming on the horizon. Some of these diseases are no longer responding quite so well to these treatments. What do? They bury their heads in the sand and say, oh, well, people want their antibiotics because they want to feel better. We got to keep using them. And we never mass deployed these things. We could have wiped out, we probably could have made the Anopheles mosquito extinct by now if we had tried. Which means you wouldn't really have malaria in the world. We wiped it out in North America. Used to be the Platte River Valley in southern Florida. Certain places in the U.S. had malaria. We deployed DDT and drained a bunch of swamps, and we wiped it out. It's gone. It doesn't exist there anymore to any large extent. It was wiped out in parts of the Caribbean. Certain African nations have been begging for DDT for years now. They want it. They want to get rid of those mosquitoes. They're like, oh, we've got 1 million people here are sick. We had tens of thousands of people dying every year. You won't even give us a batch of DDT to help ease our pain. And we're sitting here worried about environmental impact or toxicity in humans through the food chain, through a bioaccumulation. I think we survived DDT when we deployed it before. We should probably deploy it again. Now, I'm not even joking about that. Fuck the eagles. Take all the bald eagles, go and shoot them with a dart, drag them into captivity, deploy DDT on a mass scale wherever they're native to, absolutely wipe out the mosquito populations, destroy the main reservoir of malaria, while you deploy as much treatment as possible to get it out of the human reservoir. Then wait until degradation takes place, the DDT goes away, over time, and then release the birds back into the wild. If that's your main concern, a couple bald eagles are going to die, in exchange for saving millions of human lives every year, go ahead and do it. Mass deploy DDT or whatever else you need to do. Probably less harmful than the shit that they spray on your food on a daily basis. You don't seem worried about bioaccumulation there. Oh yeah, glycophosphate, nicotinoid, pesticides, Roundup, anything else. Those are just fine because they, successfully suppress any studies that show that it's neurotoxic. That's not a problem. The stuff we used in the past was always a problem. It was always toxic. It was always a bunch of bullshit. Now we've got these new companies. They have morals. They have ethics. No, they don't. You should mass deploy DDT. You should consider other methods too. What about rotating the use of antibiotics for certain infections? Like, let's say you have Staphylococcus and you're trying to wipe it out. Deploy an antibiotic against it. When it stops being so effective, stop using it and switch to another. Don't just compound a bunch of them together. You'll run into the same problem. I think that's going to become a huge problem. You're probably multiplying the evolutionary rate of these diseases against antibiotics, antivirals, and everything else that you're using. We should look at sanitation more. Proper sanitation can reduce the number of mosquitoes in an area. We've got Southeast Asia. It's quite wet, and there are a lot of swampy areas there. Does anybody identify what the problem may be? Why there are so many malaria cases there to begin with? Or in Africa, where sanitation, in the sense of the Western world, is largely absent outside of the more affluent parts of a handful of urban centers? Yeah, I think we've identified why so many people are sick. They won't even let them deploy DDT against it. Now you've got super malaria that doesn't even respond to the treatment used for the disease itself, as opposed to just destroying a bunch of mosquitoes in the first place and sanitizing things so the population's lower and it spreads more slowly. Maybe that would have helped, but we never thought of that, did we? We abandoned the concept of sanitation and spraying and prevention in many cases. We've largely abandoned them in favor of treating people once they've become sick. Don't you see how this could be a problem? And what about mass vaccination? We should have destroyed polio by now. It shouldn't even exist in the world. But we got lazy. And then a war zone crops up in Syria, some new polio cases. Wonderful. It breaks through containment there too. Leprosy. For years and years, we've been declining the number of people who are afflicted with leprosy. Again, we should have wiped it out by now. It should be a case or two a year in the whole world of leprosy. Instead, you've still got tens of thousands of people now who are deformed and scarred because the medical community didn't decide that it was a priority. We need to be a lot more draconian in how we handle these. As the world population becomes larger and more dense, as travel becomes more and more common and quick, we're going to have to think about new ways to tackle disease. Otherwise, we're setting ourselves up for a pandemic. Who knows what disease it will be down the line that causes it? We're setting ourselves up for a pandemic that'll knock most of mankind back into the Dark Ages. And all these fragile developing economies in parts of Southeast Asia, certainly, parts of Latin America, including Africa, especially the Ivory Coast, will collapse. They'll go back to having no infrastructure. Hundreds of millions, maybe billions, will die as the result of the medical community's malfeasance in attempting to wipe these diseases out instead of just treating them topically. That's about all. Peace out.